So now that we've finished testing out the Shadow Surfer build and the Infinimus build, X-Files has clearly created its own niche inside of the meta. Proccing this thing is a huge powerhouse of outputting as much damage as possible on Shadow builds. But the one thing that I had left unexplored at this point was the inclusion of Mendeln. Now in Season 1 we had created an Infinimus Mendeln hybrid. The whole purpose of it was to prove that you could kill Echo of Lilith, do Nightmare Dungeon 100, etc. without using the Bone Prison bug, which had been patched out in Season 2. But because of the fact that we had done that, everybody's been asking me nonstop, when are you going to revisit Infinimus with Mendeln? Can you make Mendeln and X-Files work together? And I'm happy to report that, yeah, we made it work. For the tool that we're going to be using to proc Mendeln and X-Files as often as possible, we're going with Blight. The reason why Blight is so important is that that initial hit of Blight will hit in an area, hitting multiple targets. We can also use the Void to be able to pull all of the targets into one clumped up area. This gives us a tool for continuously crowd controlling, even when Corpse Tendrils is on cooldown. And the second bonus of Blight is not only does it have an initial hit with a really good lucky hit chance, but it also deals damage over time. So this allows us to proc both Mendeln and X-Files with a single skill. The third benefit of Blight is that single hit and then the ticking damage over time can all stack, and that allows us to build up Blighted very quickly, one of the biggest multipliers that you can get on a Mendeln build, since it applies to, again, both the X-Files damage and the Mendeln damage. Another fantastic benefit, and this will be the last one that I gush on about, is the fact that we can do it at range and we can spam it very effectively. We're actually going to be building our minions into and our vampire powers so that we can basically spam Blight as often as necessary, only using the Raised Skeleton buff, which will heal our minions as well as bring them back from the dead, but also gain us a ton of essence gen, since we're able to proc a huge amount of corpses because we're just generally a darkness build with a lot of lucky hit. It means we should never really have essence problems. And not only that, if you were to get really lucky rolls on your boots as well as your amulet, you can basically spam Blight non-stop. So now that we have our great lucky hit tool, what does the rest of the build need to do to be able to empower us to actually be able to survive and keep our minions up? Obviously Decrepify for the huge amount of cooldown reduction. This is what the Infinimus build is all about. The other benefit of Decrepify is obviously the damage reduction and the slow effect. So this will be auto triggering our control glyph in the Paragon board for added damage. It also means that we can reduce all incoming damage. That's not only going to protect us, but equally going to protect our minions as well, since they're going to get the full effect of the damage reduction on Decrepify. Obviously Corpse Tendrils makes it onto the build. Pixel pulling everything into an area means that the AoE damage both from X-Files and from Mendeln will be as effective as possible. It applies crowd control for activating all the things that say that, and then on top of that it's going to apply our vulnerable procs. While we can trigger this from our vampire powers as well, sometimes it's just really nice to stay at range while your minions are tanking the brunt of the force and still being able to apply that vulnerable damage. It's actually one of the few ways that we can proactively apply a huge damage multiplier, since we're also going to be using Grasping Veins. Now, Grasping Veins here on the amulet is obviously a weird inclusion, but the more I sat down and thought about it, I asked the question, what scales X-Files damage and what scales Mendeln damage? And that is getting as many multipliers as possible, which means critting as often as possible. So with our Grasping Veins on and our Bone Storm up, giving us 50% critical strike chance right there means that we can very proactively expect our damage to be critting, on top of the fact that we're going to be running crit chance on our gloves as well, and then trying to stack a pretty decent amount of dexterity. Then on top of that, it gives a huge amount of crit damage multiplier as well. So while you may expect Blighted to be on the amulet here, Grasping Veins just pound for pound ends up being a much better vehicle, and in a very small way it does buff our minions as much as possible, since they do gain 30% of our critical strike chance above the 5% base that they have. So when we apply Grasping Veins, it does mean that they're gaining 10% crit. Now, do not get it twisted, your minions are doing effectively no damage at all here, but the fact that it does buff them is something that you can point to and go, hey, you know what, we're giving them a little bit of love. Bone Storm along with Ultimate Shadow returns onto the build as well. This is an amazing tool for proccing X-Files, obviously gives us a huge amount of damage reduction, and it's also going to be triggering Shielding Storm to be able to generate barrier near 100% of the time, since we can proactively expect Decrepify to be able to reduce our cooldowns. Decrepify is not only going to be proccing off of all the damage that we do, all of our trigger damage from Mendeln and X-Falls, but it's also going to be triggering from whenever our minions are hit with Thorns damage, and the Mendeln ring comes with Thorns damage right on it, so you don't have to worry about getting that on any other piece of gear. Then lastly, to round it out, it wouldn't be Infinimus without Blood Mist. This is obviously an amazing tool. While it's less important with Metamorphosis, it's also a really great mobility skill since we can rely on using Ghost Walkers on our boots, as well as having Blood Soaked on our offhand. Blood Soaked is also going to add more ticks that will proc Shadow Blight, more ticks that'll proc Blighted, and more ticks that have an opportunity to lucky hit for X-Falls, as well as to a very minor degree Mendeln. Probably one of the more interesting changes to this build that you might expect from an Infinimus build is not running Howl from below. We actually need an additional aspect slot to be able to fit Blighted somewhere on the build. So we're going to go with gloves that have attack speed, critical strike chance, and lucky hit chance. On top of that, I'm going with a little bit of an off-meta option here, which is critical strike chance against injured enemies. We really want to be fighting monsters outside of the healthy range. We actually spend a pretty decent amount of time with monsters in the 0 to 80% damage range. Not only is getting them out of the healthy status as fast as possible, going to proc their Paragon with the Essence Glyph. That's going to give us another huge critical strike damage multiplier. But on top of that, once we do get them down into the injured status, we'll be able to more quickly churn out the damage with a higher base crit chance so that we're not always relying on the Grasping Veins and the Bone Storm to be up. So now that you've seen the gameplay, which again, this isn't a tier 70 right now, I would show you the Paragon that I have currently set up for this character, but I basically just tried to shoehorn in the glyphs from a summoner build into my Infinimus build, and you cannot do that. So luckily I have a D4 planner on max roll built out. I'm going to have the link to that down below. I will have this updated in the max roll guide within the next day or so. It takes me a little bit to format it, and I have to completely recreate the Infinimus Mendeln setup inside of the guide itself. So for right now, use the D4 planner that I'm going to include. And you want to look at the Infinimus plus Mendeln set. I'll show you that very quickly, just so that you know where to find it. Whenever you're using one of our build guides on the D4 planner, just remember that there are different sets down here. So this is the basic Infinimus set that you're going to be looking at, and this is where I have nested the Infinimus plus Mendeln setup. So you'll be able to find that right here. Again, the link is here. The link is also in the Discord. A ton of people have been joining the Discord. If you haven't already, consider doing that. I maintain all my build guide links there. All of the new build guides that I haven't put onto Maxwell yet are also maintained there. That's where you can find Shadow Surfer if you've been looking for it. But now that we have that, let's just very quickly go over the Book of the Dead and the skeleton options that we're going with, and then the skill tree, which again you can see in the D4 planner, but I just want to talk about the nuances of it, and then I'll actually go through the Paragon in the D4 planner because mine on this character is hyper scuffed. For the Book of the Dead, there's actually a couple different options here. Now I ultimately ended up going with skirmishers, being able to summon an additional skirmisher. We don't care about the damage. If you don't have good enough gear to support this, like if you don't have enough maximum minion life yet, absolutely run defenders. Defenders were surviving so much better than everything else, and obviously they should, but quite literally they were just pound for pound the tankiest, best versions, and until I had my glyphs figured out, this is the only way that I could keep these guys alive. Having an additional skirmisher does mean that your Mendeln proc just literally gets one more skeleton to proc off of, so that's just a direct additional multiplier of its damage, but you can be using Reaper skeletons. I never really found that I needed more corpses than the corpses that I could generate. We are a shadow build. We are spamming Blight and Blood Mist and Bone Storm. We're generating a ton of corpses. So ultimately, I don't think that Reapers are necessary. Not only that, while it's really difficult to pinpoint to it, Reapers are generating corpses. They feel like they're generating less corpses than they did before. I tried to test it. I couldn't find any like hard evidence to really point to an exact thing that was happening, but they are generating corpses. Don't believe anybody who says that they aren't. They just totally are. And it might be that now they only generate one corpse per attack as opposed to one corpse per monster hit. That might be the difference, but it's really hard to say. For the skeleton mages, you'll notice that we're using cold mages generate essence. You might ask the question, why would you ever possibly need that? It turns out that spamming Blight as often as possible uses a lot of essence. And unless you have literally perfect essence cost reduction, I don't think that you can really manage it strictly off of consuming corpses alone. And I'd rather be able to cast Blight more often for more opportunities to proc our actual damage. So that's why I'm using cold mages here. You could also use Shadow Mages that fire off an additional attack. This will help to stack Shadow Blight more quickly, which isn't terrible. Shadow Blight is obviously another facet of our damage output, but I really like the Cold Mages here. And then for sacrificing the Golem, we are going with the Iron Sacrifice for the additional crit multiplier. You honestly could go with Bone just for the additional attack speed. Your minions will gain 3% attack speed from this, and then on top of that, you'll just be able to generate Essence faster as well as cast Blight faster. I don't think that's strictly wrong. It kind of comes down to what you personally like, but I was going for max damage output here, and I do think that we ultimately benefit from being able to output that damage more effectively with this sacrifice. Then from the skill tree, just because I know people are going to ask because they do all of the time, we only put the 2 points into here because you literally have to get down to the next sphere. I know we're not using Reap. I agree. I wish I didn't have to put 2 points here, but you do. We only pick up the 1 point Blight. We really don't care about Blight's damage itself, just for the fact that it can proc things. If you wanted to, you could take some points out of Blood Mist, because theoretically you should be able to manage the cooldown on Blood Mist just fine. I don't think you really care about the Blight damage, but if you personally do, go ahead and do that. And then we're going to max out everything that you would assume that we're going to typically. We do want to max out Grim Harvest for the essence here. We're going with Death's Embrace as opposed to Death's Reach. We are typically within melee range. We want to pick up Skeleton Mage Mastery as well as Skeleton Warrior Mastery to max out their opportunities to actually survive a hit. You'll notice that we're not picking up Terror at all. I just don't think that, like, pound for pound, that this is the most valuable node that we can actually put the damage into. I would much rather pick up Gloom. I would much rather stagger bosses faster, and I want that mobility from Reaper's Pursuit. So we sacrifice the points here. Building down into the last tier, we pick up Inspiring Lead for the attack speed for ourselves as well as our minions, and then Death's Defense. I don't think that Bonded and Essence at this point is really worth it for their survivability, because they increased the cooldown for Raised Skeleton to be 8 seconds. Now, the way that Bonded and Essence works, it means that at the end of the 8 seconds, they'll heal. Waiting 8 seconds for your minions to heal is not really good enough, so I personally don't put any points into here. You could pull out a couple from Crippling Darkness to drop it into here. I wouldn't recommend it. And then obviously we're picking up Shadow Blight. Then for the vampire powers, I do think that we're picking some interesting options here, and it kind of depends on what you exactly want. I was playing around with using Undying, and oddly enough, I survived more often. We are spamming all of the time, so it's kind of nice to be able to stand still and spam inside of a bleed effect or a poison effect, or just be able to tank a bit better so that we can kind of manage taking some of the damage from our minions. I know that sounds kind of weird, but we are near infinitely tankier than our minions will ever be. So this was definitely helping. If you don't want to use this, I would recommend using Anticipation, just to be able to get Bone Storm up a little bit faster. It kind of helps with the damage as well, which isn't terrible, but realistically it's just for that cooldown. Then obviously Prey on the Weak, just for that additional vulnerable damage here. We are going with Domination because we're going to be applying crowd control a lot. The other cool part about it is that you can swap out Domination, which is typically better when you're fighting just general monsters and elite monsters, since you can apply crowd control there, over to Terror for bosses. So you may have seen this in my Infinimus build guide as well, but putting this on for a boss means the moment that they're staggered, we have a 100% chance to crit. So all of our X-Files and all of our Mendeln are going to do near double damage for the length of time that they're staggered. So that's a really cool tech. Basically what you just need to do is you need to have enough packs on your gear so that taking this off and putting this on won't remove one of them being activated, and then you can swap it out whenever you want. Feed the Coven is the second thing that we're using to actually help moderate and manage our essence generation. So we really don't care about the damage portion of it too much, but it is nice. It's a, you know, it's a 10% damage multiplier. Our minions get 30% of that, and it does help for X-Files and Mendeln. But the big part here is that they have a 60% lucky hit chance to be able to generate primary resource for us whenever they attack a monster. And that's huge. There were a lot of times where I was able to spam Blight throughout the entirety of a fight because my minions were just carrying the torch of generating the essence for me. And then obviously Metamorphosis. I mean, just being able to gain Unstoppable from evading is fantastic, but obviously this thing is just kind of like an auto include on every single build, but you still got to talk about it in case people don't know why. Now, if you ever wanted to see just the wildest Paragon branching path ever, this is probably going to be the one here. Interestingly enough, we're kind of trying to do two things with our Paragon tree. We're trying to make sure that we do have relevant multipliers. So we are using Control as a relevant multiplier, and we are using Essence as a viable multiplier. On top of that, we're using Amplify as a viable multiplier here. And then everything else is really just to make sure that our minions can actually survive. So we're going to build into Cult Leader with Dead Razor just to get the damage reduction. We build out just a little bit for them to have attack speed, just so we don't miss out on any Mendeln procs if there is one. Maybe we procced multiple times, luckily enough. We just want to make sure that we're not hindering our ability to output that damage. Incentive Death, we're literally putting Warrior just to hit the minimum requirement to get armor on our minions as well. Inside of Wither, we're literally hitting the minimum requirement for Mage to get that all res. The moment I put Mage on with that all res, my minions effectively doubled their survivability. It's kind of wild. I think they're obviously only inheriting 30% of our resistances, and I think their base resistances are crap, especially in World Tier 4, and that's why this feels so much better. We do build out to Gnawing Darkness for a little bit more damage to targets who are affected by shadow damage over time and damage to elites, and then we build over into Bone Graft, like I said, for Essence. We don't really care about anything else on this board. And then Incentive Death, we are picking up the Legendary node as well as the Ruin rare node here. The reason why this one's so important, and I kind of alluded to it with the Essence Glyph, we want to get monsters out of the healthy status as fast as possible so that all of our crits gain that 1.22 multiplier. So being able to do more damage to a healthy target actually has a much higher reward for us than it normally would. But I'm not going to go through all of this. I'm going to leave the build planner here. I couldn't even explain every single nuance here, but you can take a look at it yourself. I do think that this is pound for pound the most efficient way that you can build out your Paragon boards. We were sitting here kind of min-maxing every single little point investment. If you find something better, please let me know. But I don't really think that there's a huge investment from building over to Infused Caster or for Armor Clad. Armor Clad does gain you maximum minion life, but what it really gains you is actually minion armor, and it turns out that the Warrior Glyph literally takes less points to get to and get to that minimum requirement than it would to build down into Cult Leader. So I think that these two nodes might be a trap, but if you really wanted to, you could sacrifice the Essence Glyph in its entirety to be able to build out to this as well if your minions aren't surviving. But as always, look to the build planner itself for the concept of what I believe the most optimal stats are. You're looking to get as many of these as you possibly can. And for your resistances, just as a quick note, I'm putting diamonds into everything because I don't know what you have personally done to invest into your resistances, but I very typically put a ruby, a topaz, as well as an emerald here so that I can cap the 3 most important resistances. And I'm most often actually overcapped on res at this point, but I don't think that you're going to be able to get there with just the diamonds unless you have like wild res on your helmet or your boots or something like that. But there we go. This is the Mendeln Infinimist X-Fall Necromancer build. You can successfully proc both of these effects. You get the benefit of having the skeletons out there with you. You're still a pretty efficient Infinimist build. You're definitely very reliant on X-Fall's damage since we can't really generate our own damage without it. It does pretty decently well at bosses. I think it's a kind of interesting middle ground between the Shadow Surfer and Infinimist. Infinimist is phenomenal at density clearing. It's pretty okay at bosses. I feel like Shadow Surfer is amazing at bosses and just lacks a bit of the mobility, but is still pretty good at density clearing. This build felt like it was doing pretty okay at density clearing, pretty okay at bosses. It has a cool aesthetic. You're using cool items. I think this is the best way to put them together. If I were to rate it, just because so many people have been asking me to rate stuff, just understand I hate rating stuff. It's all so wildly speculative and like completely relative depending on exactly what point you're talking about. But if I were to put this down, I definitely think that it's weaker than the base Infinimist build. I think it would also be weaker than the best version of Mendeln, which is probably using Bone Spear and is relying a lot more on that damage and a higher lucky hit percentage chance. But that being said, as far as meshing the two builds together, I think it brings a lot of survivability that you otherwise wouldn't normally be able to enjoy on the Bone Spear version, as well as bringing a bit more consistent damage output than you would typically get from just using the X-Falls, as far as burst damage is concerned for killing a boss, or any other example where you really just want to bring down one tanky dude very quickly. I do think that the build is a ton of fun. If you think that I could have explained something better, you have a different question, a different setup, or a suggestion, please let me know down in the comments. It's been great. I've been getting a ton of really good comments, a ton of really good feedback inside of the Discord, which again, the link is down in the description below. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. What are you doing? Just click the button. Click the button and tell YouTube that you think that the Necromancer is the best Diablo 4 class and you want to see me be able to put more time and more effort into putting out these types of videos, because I love what we're doing right now and I would love to be able to go like completely full time. This is like pipe dream, eye in the sky thing, but I still have a ding dang day job and that's cutting into all the time I could be spending theory crafting. So throw a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I look forward to seeing you in the next video.